It was a Thursday evening when my life, or at least the life I thought I had, collapsed in a single sentence. My husband stood in front of me, his voice as flat as if he were reading a line from a contract, not speaking to the woman who had shared his home, his bed, and his years. "You have 9 days to decide if you want to stay," he said, each word heavy, mechanical, as if they had been rehearsed long before. He didn't raise his voice, didn't break into anger, didn't tremble or hesitate. He simply delivered it the way someone might hand over a termination letter at work, cold and professional, expecting compliance. For a second, I wondered if I had heard correctly, if perhaps he was joking, testing me, trying to provoke a reaction. But his eyes betrayed nothing except that sharp, calculated detachment that comes when a decision has already been made, and the pretense of offering me choice was just a formality. I sat there, silent, my hands resting on my lap, my heartbeat suddenly a slow drum I could hear inside my ears. I didn't scream. I didn't ask why. The words felt like ice pressing against my skin, but instead of shattering me, they crystallized something inside. I had spent 15 years believing that marriage meant two people building a life together, holding each other through storms, planning futures. But in that instant, I understood the imbalance with a clarity that was almost violent. He wasn't offering me 9 days to decide. He was declaring that he had already stepped outside, that he was giving me a countdown only to soothe his conscience. The silence that followed was unbearable for him, not for me. He expected tears, pleading, an emotional storm that would validate his superiority. He expected me to crumble, so he could reassure himself that he was indispensable, that I was too weak to stand without him. But I didn't move. I studied him as if I were looking at a stranger, a man I had once known but who had just shown his final, truest face. His hand fidgeted near his phone on the table, his thumb brushing the screen like he was waiting for a message, as if there were something or someone more important than this moment between us. That told me more than his ultimatum. It wasn't 9 days for me to decide. It was 9 days for him to cover his tracks, to let me quietly resign so he could slip into another life without scandal. My mind ran through years of small dismissals, moments where he had chosen convenience over connection, where my voice had been muted under the noise of his priorities. Suddenly, they all lined up in perfect order, each memory clicking into place like stones forming a wall. I remembered birthdays he forgot, promises left behind, nights he came home late with vague excuses, mornings where he wouldn't even look at me while sipping his coffee. The ultimatum wasn't new. It was simply the first time he had spoken out loud what his actions had been whispering for years. I nodded slowly, not to agree, but to seal the moment inside me. 9 days, I repeated, and the way my voice sounded, calm, deliberate, steady, startled even me. He leaned back, slightly confused, perhaps expecting a different tone, maybe a breakdown. Instead, I gave him nothing, and in that emptiness, I saw a flicker of irritation. For the first time, he wasn't sure how this would play out, and that gave me an odd sense of power. He stood, muttered something about needing to get some work done, and left the room, his phone lighting up in his hand as he walked away. The air felt heavier when I was alone. I sat in the stillness of our living room, surrounded by furniture we had chosen together, photographs that told stories now stained with deceit, and the clock ticking with the rhythm of his ultimatum. 9 days. It was supposed to feel like a prison sentence, but instead it felt like an opening, like the universe had given me a deadline not to decide if I wanted to stay, but to decide how I would leave. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not in the hours that followed. I lay awake in bed, listening to him typing on his laptop in the other room, wondering if it was truly work or if he was writing to her, the faceless presence I could already feel haunting the edges of this ultimatum. Every tap of the keyboard was like a countdown, echoing through the walls. And instead of fear, instead of despair, I felt something colder and sharper growing in me, the beginnings of resolve. If he thought 9 days would keep me paralyzed, waiting, uncertain, he was wrong. By the time the morning light began to filter through the curtains, I knew that those 9 days weren't his. They were mine. He had given me a deadline, but what he didn't understand was that in setting that clock, he had also handed me the structure I needed. He believed I would spend them begging for his attention, debating if I was enough, weighing whether to forgive. But from the very first day, my decision had already been made, and it wasn't about staying or leaving. It was about how to turn his countdown into my opportunity. That night marked the end of illusions. In 9 days, he thought he would hear my answer. What he didn't know was that by day 1, my silence had already been my first move. The game had started, and he hadn't even realized it. The morning after his ultimatum felt heavier than the night before, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his words and were now echoing them back at me with every creak of the house. 9 days. It replayed in my head with a rhythm that almost mocked me, and yet instead of crushing me, it carved out a hollow space where something else could grow. He acted as though he had thrown me into limbo, but in truth, he had only revealed how far removed he already was. That realization sharpened with every movement he made, every glance, every sigh. I became an observer in my own home, watching him like one might study an actor who had forgotten the audience could see behind the curtain. At breakfast, the silence was unbearable, not because it was empty, but because it was filled with everything unsaid. He sipped his coffee, scrolling through his phone with the kind of concentration he rarely reserved for me. His thumb flicked across the screen quickly, almost impatiently, pausing every now and then, his lips curving slightly into an expression that was too tender to belong to a conversation about work. It wasn't guilt that showed on his face. It was anticipation. I realized then that the 9 days weren't about me at all. They were about her, whoever she was. He had someone waiting at the other end of those messages, someone who thought she was about to win, someone who believed she was the reason my husband's voice had grown cold when it addressed me. And perhaps she was right. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't lean forward to demand answers or explanations, because I understood that forcing him to reveal anything would give him the illusion of control. Instead, I stayed quiet, ate my toast, and let the silence stretch like a rope between us. I watched the discomfort flicker across his features, that subtle tightening around his jaw, the restless way he shifted in his chair. He was waiting for me to break, to beg, to ask what he meant, to start a fight that would give him a sense of victory. But I gave him nothing. My silence became a mirror, and he began to see himself reflected in it. A man who had already decided, but who lacked the courage to admit it openly. As the hours passed, I noticed how quickly he tried to distance himself from me physically, retreating into his office with the door closed, muttering about deadlines and meetings. I knew better. I could hear the faint sound of laughter through the thin walls, laughter that didn't belong to spreadsheets or conference calls. I imagined her voice on the other side of the line, bright and eager, feeding the arrogance that made him believe he could dangle my life like a coin toss and still expect me to remain static, paralyzed, uncertain. He thought he was the puppeteer, but with every moment of silence, I was cutting the strings he believed bound me. That night, lying beside him in the same bed, but separated by an invisible gulf, I studied the way his body turned away from me, his back a fortress I was no longer invited to cross. His breathing was steady, shallow, the kind of rhythm that comes not from peace, but from pretense. I knew he wasn't asleep. I knew his mind was elsewhere, already building a life in which I was only a shadow of an inconvenience. But he underestimated me. He thought the silence meant surrender, that my lack of confrontation meant I was frozen, too stunned to act. He didn't understand that silence can be sharper than any scream, more deliberate than any argument. My stillness was not weakness. It was observation, calculation, the slow gathering of strength that doesn't explode, but rather erodes. On the second day, I began to notice the little things that revealed his double life. A shirt ironed with care, though he never cared for details when it was just me. A cologne I hadn't smelled in years, suddenly sprayed again before he left for errands that stretched suspiciously long. Even the way he shaved was different, cleaner, as though he wanted his face to match some imagined version of himself that existed only in the eyes of another woman. Every detail screamed confession, though he never spoke the words aloud. His ultimatum was his excuse, the legal loophole in his mind to justify what he was already doing. And yet, the more he revealed, the more I stayed quiet. I found a strange power in that silence, in knowing he didn't understand it, in seeing how it unsettled him. He began to glance at me more often, brief flickers of suspicion crossing his face, as if he was beginning to wonder whether I truly was processing the 9 days as he had intended, or whether I was doing something else entirely. He would ask simple questions in the evenings, questions that felt like tests. "So, have you thought about what you want?" he asked once, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. I simply nodded, offering no further detail. The lack of an answer was an answer in itself, and I watched the uncertainty ripple through him. He wanted control, but my silence denied him that. The house itself became a stage where silence performed louder than words. I moved with purpose, not rushing, not retreating, just existing in a way that made it clear I was not clinging. I prepared meals. I read books. I folded laundry, all with a composure that contrasted with the frantic secrecy humming in his actions. It was this calm that began to gnaw at him, the realization that I was not breaking, that perhaps I was planning, that perhaps the countdown he had given me wasn't ticking toward his victory, but toward something entirely different. The silence after his words was not emptiness. It was the first act of resistance, the slow dismantling of the role he thought I would play. Each day that passed, I let him believe he had written the script, but inside me, I was already composing a different ending. He thought the 9 days would grant him dominance, but the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He had given me time, and I intended to use every moment of it, not to decide if I wanted to stay, but to ensure that when I left, I would never be the one looking back. The first official day of the countdown arrived not with the sound of alarm clocks or dramatic revelations, but with an almost deceptive normalcy. The sun poured itself lazily through the curtains, bathing the room in the kind of golden light that once might have felt comforting, but now only mocked me with its indifference. My husband was already awake, moving briskly around the room, his cologne sharp in the air, his movements too precise to belong to a man living in the comfort of stability. He dressed as though preparing for a performance, not for errands or work, adjusting his tie in the mirror, smoothing the lines of his shirt, staring at himself with the approval of a man who wanted to be admired. I lay there pretending to still be half asleep, but my eyes watched every gesture, storing each detail like pieces of evidence in a case that no longer needed a jury. The ultimatum had already condemned him, and I no longer needed proof for myself. But proof, I realized, might serve me in other ways. He left the house with that restless eagerness that betrayed where his thoughts truly were. The sound of the door closing was sharp, but it was also liberating. For the first time, I was alone with the silence he thought would suffocate me, but instead, it breathed into me a sense of clarity I had not felt in years. Day 1 was not about reflection. It was not about grieving. It was not about pleading for a love that had already expired. It was about turning inward and asking myself not what I had lost, but what I could create from the ashes he had so carelessly left behind. He had given me 9 days as a leash, but I chose to see them as 9 steps, each one bringing me closer to freedom, to strategy, to transformation. I began by walking through the house, room by room, not as a wife tidying up but as a strategist surveying territory. Every photograph on the walls, every item of clothing folded in drawers, every receipt tucked into his desk became part of a silent inventory. I realized that for years I had lived in this space as a participant, but now I viewed it as an archivist, collecting information, noticing what he wanted hidden, piecing together the inconsistencies he believed I had ignored. On his desk, I found bank statements with odd withdrawals, small enough to slip past casual attention, but frequent enough to build a trail. A receipt for a dinner he had never mentioned, at a restaurant I had never been to, dated the same night he had claimed he was at the office late. These weren't accidents. They were breadcrumbs, and I collected them carefully, tucking them away like tools I would one day use. But it wasn't only about him. As I stood there holding those receipts, I realized that the true question was not whether he had betrayed me. That was already certain. The question was how I would position myself to ensure that when the dust settled, I would not be the discarded one, but the one who had controlled the ending. He wanted me to waste 9 days deciding whether to stay or leave, but my decision had already been made the moment he handed me that deadline. I would not stay. I would not beg. I would not play the role of the rejected wife who clings to dignity while watching everything slip away. I would craft a different ending, one where he discovered too late that in trying to control me, he had given me the very time I needed to dismantle him. The plan was not fully formed in that first day, but its outline emerged like a map unfolding itself inside my mind. I knew I would need to be methodical, patient, and above all, silent. He thrived on the belief that he was in control, that I was paralyzed, stunned, incapable of movement. The power of my plan would lie in his blindness. He would never see it coming, because he would never imagine I was capable of anything other than despair. That would be his first mistake. As the day stretched on, I allowed myself moments of reflection, but even these were not drenched in sorrow. They were analytical. I thought about the years I had spent building him up, supporting his ambitions, smoothing his path. He believed he was self-made, but I could trace in my memory every sacrifice I had made to ensure his stability. And now, ironically, those sacrifices became the scaffolding for my resolve. I had been the one quietly holding everything together, and that meant I knew exactly where the cracks were, where to press, where to let go. He might have believed he was offering me 9 days to weigh my worth, but in truth, he had offered me 9 days to remember just how indispensable I had been to his life, and how destructive my absence could become. That evening, when he returned home, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I greeted him with the same calm detachment I had the night before, neither cold nor warm, just steady. He searched my face for answers, for cracks in my composure, but I offered none. He ate quickly, his eyes darting often to his phone, and when he excused himself with some half-hearted excuse about a late call, I smiled politely and cleared the dishes. He left again that night, dressed in clothes too sharp for a simple meeting, and though he thought he was moving unnoticed, I marked the time, the fragrance of his cologne, the eagerness in his stride. Every detail became part of the architecture of the plan I was slowly building. Lying in bed alone, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint hum of the city outside, the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance. 9 days. To him, it was a cage. To me, it was scaffolding, a structure upon which I would build the future he never anticipated. On day 1, my plan had no final form, no clear execution, but it existed, alive, pulsing quietly beneath the surface of my calm exterior. It was not born of desperation, but of defiance, not of grief, but of strategy. He thought I was trapped within his countdown, but what he didn't know was that I had already stepped outside it. The 9 days belonged to him in words, but in truth, they belonged to me, and with every tick of the clock, I felt less like a woman waiting for judgment, and more like an architect, drafting the blueprint of his undoing. By the time sleep finally claimed me, I understood something with perfect clarity. The ultimatum had not been a death sentence for me, but a birth of resolve, of strategy, of freedom. Day 1 had not been about deciding whether to stay. It had been about choosing how to leave, and how to ensure that when I did, he would be the one left wondering how everything had slipped through his fingers. By the time the second day unfolded, I no longer felt like I was merely reacting to the ultimatum he had imposed. Instead, I was beginning to pull on threads that he hadn't even realized were visible, threads that, once tugged, began to unravel the fabric of his carefully constructed facade. His 9 days were supposed to keep me suspended in indecision, but what he had truly done was open a window for me to observe him without the blinders I had worn for years. And it didn't take long before the truth behind his ultimatum began to reveal itself, not in a dramatic confession, but in small, careless details that he thought I would never notice. That morning, his phone buzzed on the table as he was in the shower. It wasn't unusual for him to leave it face down, but on this particular morning, he had forgotten. The screen lit up briefly, and though the message itself was locked, the name that appeared was enough to slice through any remaining illusions. Vanessa. The intimacy of the name on his screen, unmarked by any professional context, gave away everything. I hadn't yet seen her face, hadn't read her words, but the certainty struck me with such force that I almost laughed at the irony. He had given me 9 days to decide if I wanted to stay, but the truth was that he had already left. That was the reason behind the countdown. It wasn't about me. It was about him buying time. about easing his conscience while setting the stage for his next chapter. Later, when he left the house under the guise of a client lunch, I followed a different trail, the receipts and statements I had collected from his desk. One charge in particular stood out: a booking at a hotel, not far from downtown, made 2 weeks earlier. The name on the invoice was his, but there was no mistaking what it implied. A 2-night stay, champagne service, a note about special arrangements. He had never mentioned it, never hinted at a business trip. The pieces fit too perfectly, and with every detail, the image of his betrayal became less abstract and more tangible. The ultimatum wasn't born of sudden discontent or marital strain. It was orchestrated. He wanted me to quietly accept the end so he could seamlessly step into a life where I no longer existed, and she did. That realization ignited something deeper in me, something beyond the initial shock. If it had only been an affair, it might have been devastating but simple. But this was manipulation layered upon betrayal. He had looked me in the eye and given me a deadline to decide, all while he had already written the script in which I was meant to disappear quietly. The arrogance of it, the cruelty wrapped in false generosity, was what stung most. And yet, rather than crushing me, it fueled the outline of the plan I had begun to form. For if he thought he could orchestrate an ending where I was silent, then my response had to be one where silence became the very tool that destroyed him. I began to search for her, this Vanessa whose name now clung to the edges of every lie. Social media was a weapon sharper than he could have imagined. With a few careful searches, I found her, not through his accounts, which were too carefully curated, but through patterns that revealed themselves when I traced contacts, mutual acquaintances, subtle overlaps in circles he thought I never noticed. There she was, a woman whose smile was plastered across filtered images, her life displayed in snapshots of dinners, weekends away, captions dripping with the kind of saccharine words that mask secrets. And in one of those photographs, the truth snapped into place like a trap closing. She wasn't alone. She had a fiancé, a man who appeared beside her in picture after picture, a man who smiled at her with the same trust I once had for my husband. That was when the ultimatum transformed completely in my mind. It was no longer about him, no longer about whether I wanted to stay. It was about her fiancé, about the collateral damage she was leaving behind, just as my husband had tried to discard me. 2 betrayals intertwined, 2 people meant to be broken quietly while their partners pursued their selfish pleasures. The symmetry of it struck me, and for the first time, I saw not just the pain, but the opportunity. The truth behind his ultimatum wasn't just that he had another woman. It was that both of them had underestimated the people they were betraying, believing we would remain in the shadows while they built their lives on lies. I saved the photographs, archived the receipts, documented the patterns. My silence was no longer passive. It was an archive, a weapon waiting to be drawn. He returned home that evening with that same false casualness, loosening his tie, kissing my cheek as though he were playing the role of a faithful husband. I smiled faintly, nodding as if I were still trapped in his 9-day limbo. But inside me, everything had shifted. I was no longer asking why he had given me this ultimatum. I knew the answer now. It wasn't an ultimatum for me. It was permission for himself. And that was the truth he could never admit aloud. That night, as he drifted into sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling once more. But this time, the weight on my chest wasn't despair. It was anticipation. I knew who she was. I knew she wasn't free. And I knew that somewhere out there, her fiancé was as unaware as I had once been, living in the shadow of a truth he hadn't yet discovered. The ultimatum had been meant to isolate me, to box me into silence. But instead, it had connected me to someone else. Someone who, like me, had been handed lies packaged as love. And if there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty as day 2 gave way to day 3, it was this. I would not face this battle alone. The discovery of Vanessa's fiancé lingered in my mind long after I had closed the glowing screen of my laptop, his face etched beside hers in picture after picture, the embodiment of a trust as fragile and doomed as my own had once been. His smile was unguarded, the smile of a man who still believed in the person standing next to him, who had not yet glimpsed the cracks hidden beneath the varnish of her staged life. I stared at him longer than I expected, not with pity, but with a strange recognition, as though in him I was seeing the reflection of the woman I might have remained if I had never glimpsed the truth behind my husband's ultimatum. He was an unwitting participant in their game, left as a placeholder until they were ready to discard him, just as I had been given 9 days to quietly erase myself. But I knew then that if the two of us were meant to be cast aside, the only logical response was not to disappear, but to converge, to bring the two sides of this fractured story together until it formed something sharper, something unbreakable. The idea of reaching out to him carried its own risks. What if he refused to believe me? What if, in his desperation to cling to the illusion, he turned on me instead of her? And yet, the alternative, remaining alone in this shadow war against two people who thought themselves clever, was intolerable. I could not dismantle this lie entirely by myself, and perhaps I didn't need to. My silence so far had been my greatest weapon, but silence shared between two betrayed souls could become something even more powerful. It could become strategy. On the third evening of the countdown, after my husband had left again for yet another meeting that reeked of cologne and contrived importance, I sat at the dining table with only the glow of my laptop illuminating the papers and notes I had already gathered. With a single keystroke, I found his profile again. His name was Daniel. It suited him, solid, dependable, the kind of name that belonged to someone who built lives rather than destroyed them. His photographs told me enough. He worked in finance, traveled for business, lived in the same city as we did, and most importantly, he was still engaged, still oblivious. His posts carried the kind of devotion that came from a man planning a future he didn't realize was already being stolen from him. I drafted a message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, the words heavy with risk and inevitability. Daniel, you don't know me, but you should, because the woman you think you're going to marry is sleeping with my husband. I stared at it for a long moment before pressing send, my chest tightening, my pulse pounding against the silence of the room. There was no undoing it now. Whatever came next, the boundaries between us had been crossed. For hours there was no response. I paced the living room, imagining him reading the words, disbelief crawling across his face, denial hardening his jaw. I knew too well the instinct to reject such a truth, to bury it beneath layers of hope. But near midnight, the reply came, sharp and to the point. Who are you? I answered simply, telling him my name, who my husband was, how long we had been married. For several tense exchanges he remained guarded, his responses clipped, suspicious. And then, when I sent him a photograph, a hotel receipt in my husband's name, a date that coincided with a weekend Vanessa had claimed she had been visiting her sister, his silence deepened into something else. Minutes passed before his next words appeared on the screen, heavier this time, less defensive. Meet me. Tomorrow. Noon. The following day, I arrived at a quiet cafe downtown, chosen deliberately for its anonymity. I scanned the room, and there he was, sitting at a table tucked into the corner, his eyes fixed on the door as though he had been waiting not just minutes but weeks, maybe months, for someone to tell him what he already suspected. When our eyes met, there was no hesitation. We both knew this conversation was inevitable. Two strangers tied together by betrayal, our lives overlapping because of the arrogance of those who thought we would never meet. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Show me," he said, his voice tight but controlled. I slid the folder across the table, filled with the small but damning pieces I had collected, receipts, screenshots, patterns of absences that aligned too perfectly. He leafed through them, his jaw tightening, his knuckles whitening around the papers. Finally, he looked up, his eyes sharp, burning not with shock, but with the fury of recognition. "I knew something was wrong," he admitted, almost to himself. "She was distant, evasive. But I never thought," he trailed off, the weight of betrayal settling over him. We sat in silence for a long moment, not the hollow silence of the ultimatum, but a silence thick with shared understanding. It was strange, almost comforting to see my own pain mirrored in someone else, to know I wasn't alone in the absurd theater they had constructed. When he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted, no longer fragile, but steadier, colder. If they think they can do this and walk away untouched, they're wrong. In that instant, An unspoken agreement formed between us. We weren't two abandoned people licking our wounds. We were allies, bound not by choice but by necessity, by the undeniable truth that together we were stronger than either of them could ever anticipate. The 9 days my husband had given me had suddenly split open into a far more dangerous timeline, one neither he nor Vanessa controlled. When I left the cafe, the city felt different, the air charged with a current I hadn't felt in years. The ultimatum no longer echoed in my mind as a sentence of exile, but as the spark that had drawn me to someone who understood, someone who, like me, refused to be erased. I walked home with a clarity I hadn't possessed before, my steps steady, my resolve sharpening. I wasn't alone anymore. The plan that had been a fragile outline in my mind was now fortified by the presence of another betrayed heart. By the time I reached my door, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had thought their secret affair would remain hidden, their betrayal neatly tucked behind smiles and excuses. But now, the silence had been broken, and what began as his ultimatum had become something else entirely, an alliance. From the moment Daniel and I left that cafe, the 9 days my husband had granted me no longer felt like a cage. They became a framework, a clock we both agreed to turn against those who thought they were clever enough to manipulate us into silence. The irony wasn't lost on me. His ultimatum had given me a deadline, but now it served as the perfect structure for dismantling him. One day, one move at a time. Each sunrise was not a reminder of my supposed indecision, but a prompt for another calculated step, another piece of the trap falling into place. It was as though I had been living blindfolded, and now, with Daniel beside me in this strange, reluctant alliance, every detail that once seemed mundane sharpened into significance. We began with information. If silence had been my weapon before, now knowledge was my shield. Daniel and I exchanged everything we knew about their patterns, cross-referencing her excuses with his lies. It was astonishing how easily the timelines overlapped, how effortlessly their deceit aligned when laid bare. A business trip he had taken in early March coincided with a spa weekend Vanessa claimed to have spent with friends. A late night at the office was paired with her sudden visit to her mother's house in another city, except neither had truly gone where they said they had. Receipts, emails, photographs, all the fragments we gathered came together into a damning mosaic. Move 1 had been made before either of them realized we had even lifted a hand. The creation of a record they could never erase. But it wasn't enough to know. We had to unsettle them, to plant small seeds of doubt in their carefully arranged story. Move 2 came the next evening, when Daniel, with a calmness I envied, sent Vanessa a message asking if she had enjoyed her supposed visit to her sister's house, casually dropping a detail that only someone else would have known. Her response, laced with hesitation, arrived minutes later, and though she tried to cover her tracks, he saw through it instantly. Meanwhile, I mirrored his tactic, asking my husband how the new restaurant downtown had been, a place I heard was difficult to book, but which happened to appear on a receipt with his name. His eyes flickered in that half-second hesitation, and I savored the discomfort it betrayed. It was subtle, not enough to cause an explosion, but enough to remind them that lies were never as invisible as they believed. Each day carried a new move. By the 3rd, I began quietly transferring small amounts of money from our joint accounts into one in my name, cloaking it under routine household expenses he never bothered to track. He had always left the details to me, trusting I would manage them with the same loyalty I had for years. That loyalty was gone now, replaced with precision, and by the time he would realize it, the safety net he assumed would always be there would have unraveled. Daniel, too, began to secure his footing, discreetly shifting shared investments out of Vanessa's reach, all while maintaining the calm demeanor of a man still oblivious to her betrayal. We were creating distance, building fortresses brick by brick, while they believed we were still asleep in the beds they had so carefully made for us. By the 4th day, the game shifted from finances to presence. We orchestrated small, seemingly accidental encounters, showing up in places where they least expected us, never aggressive, always casual. At a coffee shop where Vanessa and my husband had once met, Daniel appeared alone, ordering a drink and sitting silently in the corner. Her reaction, as he later told me, had been priceless. Shock, disguised as politeness. Her eyes darting nervously, her composure fraying under the weight of what she thought she had hidden. That same day, I walked into a boutique I knew my husband frequented with her, offering the saleswoman a smile as if nothing were wrong, but catching the slight falter in her expression when she realized the wife now stood in the very space where the mistress had once paraded. These encounters weren't confrontations, but echoes, reminders that their secret world wasn't so secret after all. By the 5th and 6th days, we escalated to more deliberate tactics. Daniel sent flowers to Vanessa's office, a gesture she assumed was from him, but which arrived conspicuously on a day when she had claimed to be traveling. Her colleagues saw them, whispered, and by the time she realized the trap, the cracks in her story had widened. I, on the other hand, began planting subtle comments among friends and family. Never accusations, only questions. "Oh, he's been traveling so much lately, I can hardly keep track. Have you heard anything?" The gossip began to ripple outward, the kind of ripple that turns into a wave long before anyone understands where it started. They had built their affair on secrecy, but we were ensuring that the shadows they relied upon were thinning with every passing hour. The 7th day arrived with an unexpected twist. My husband grew restless, pacing more often, his questions sharper, his attempts at charm more transparent. "Have you decided yet?" he asked me one evening, his voice laced with the impatience of a man who no longer cared for the outcome but wanted the finality of his plan to unfold. I looked at him calmly, answered only with, "I'm still thinking," and left the silence to do the rest. That silence unsettled him more than any argument could have, because in it lay a truth he couldn't decipher. He expected grief or anger, but my composure was a riddle he couldn't solve. That night, as he slipped away again, I knew he was unraveling, sensing something beyond his control. The 8th move was the one Daniel and I had saved deliberately. The confrontation staged not with shouting, but with presence. We agreed that our betrayal deserved an audience, not for cruelty, but for clarity, to force them into the mirror they had avoided for too long. That move, however, belonged to another day, the day when everything would converge. For now, the 9th and final move was patience itself, the quiet certainty that we had built a network of cracks beneath their feet. As I lay in bed on the 9th night, the ultimatum almost at its end, I realized the transformation that had taken place within me. I was no longer the woman waiting to be chosen or discarded. I was the architect of each step, the one shaping the narrative they thought they controlled. 9 days had been a gift disguised as punishment, a countdown they believed would weaken me, but instead fortified me. Each day had been a move, and together they formed not just resistance but strategy, a dance that neither of them had even noticed until it was too late. And so, as the final hours of his ultimatum drew near, I felt no fear, no hesitation. What awaited was not a decision about staying or leaving, but the culmination of 9 days he had so arrogantly given me. He thought time was on his side, but time had become mine, and now the final act was waiting just beyond the horizon. By the 7th day, the mask my husband had so carefully worn for weeks, perhaps months, began to fracture, not with a dramatic collapse, but with the faintest of fissures that only someone watching closely could see. His confidence, the smug certainty with which he had delivered his ultimatum, had been eroding in silence, and though he tried desperately to keep his performance intact, the cracks revealed themselves in ways too subtle for him to control. What he didn't know was that those small fissures were all I needed to confirm that the pressure Daniel and I had been applying was beginning to take root, burrowing beneath the surface of his carefully cultivated composure until it grew unbearable. It started in his voice, where once his words had carried that deliberate flatness, that air of control. Now they wavered at the edges, breaking into impatience. "So, have you decided?" he asked one morning, his eyes darting toward mine with something almost frantic hiding beneath the veneer of calm. I looked at him steadily, my expression unreadable, and simply answered, "Not yet." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I watched as he shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around his coffee cup, his jaw clenching ever so slightly. He didn't like waiting. He didn't like that his 9-day script wasn't unfolding exactly as he had imagined. The control he thought he wielded was slipping, and he didn't know why. Later that day, as he prepared to leave for another meeting, his tie trembled slightly in his hands as he adjusted it in the mirror. It was such a small gesture, but I had lived with him long enough to recognize the difference between confidence and doubt. He caught my reflection in the glass and held my gaze for a second longer than usual, as if searching for something he couldn't name. I gave him nothing. My silence had become his prison, and every attempt he made to draw a reaction from me only deepened the bars. When he finally turned away, I could see the unease in his shoulders, the stiffness of a man who could no longer convince himself that he was untouchable. Daniel and I had agreed not to rush, not to force a confrontation before the stage was properly set. But even without the final act, the psychological weight was already working its way into their lives. Vanessa, as Daniel reported, had grown erratic in her explanations. She flinched when he asked innocent questions, stumbled over details she once delivered with ease. The flowers he had sent to her office, that simple gesture of entrapment, had sparked whispers among her colleagues, whispers she couldn't silence. She was unraveling in her own way, and I knew my husband must have felt it too, even if he couldn't admit it. Their secret was no longer airtight. It was leaking, and the pressure of keeping it intact was crushing them both. By the evening of the 7th day, the shift in him was undeniable. He came home earlier than expected, pacing the living room like a man searching for something he had lost but couldn't name. "You're very quiet," he said finally, his voice sharper than before, as though accusing me of something. I smiled faintly, folded the book I had been reading, and looked at him without flinching. "I'm thinking," I replied, letting the words linger in the air. He stared at me for a long time, his expression caught between suspicion and frustration, before finally turning away. That was when I saw it. The first real crack in his confidence, a moment of vulnerability he couldn't hide, the realization that the woman he thought was paralyzed might be planning something entirely different. It wasn't only in his words and gestures, it was in his habits too. He began to check his phone compulsively, glancing at it even during dinner, his fingers drumming against the table when no new messages appeared. The secrecy that had once empowered him now seemed to suffocate him, as if he feared that at any moment the lies he had built would come crashing down. When he thought I wasn't looking, he scrolled furiously through his messages, deleting, rearranging, covering his tracks. But I noticed everything, and each frantic swipe of his finger was another reminder that his confidence was no longer unshakable. Even in his sleep, the cracks showed. He tossed and turned beside me, mumbling incoherently, his body restless under the weight of dreams that betrayed his calm exterior. One night, I heard him whisper a name, hers. The sound of it, half-formed and fragile, slipped from his lips like a confession, and though he didn't know it, that single syllable confirmed more than any evidence I could have gathered. It wasn't just an affair, it was obsession. And obsession, once revealed, has a way of destroying itself. I found myself strangely detached as I observed these changes, not with sorrow, but with the cold clarity of a strategist watching a rival stumble. The man who had given me 9 days to decide was unraveling on his own, undone not by confrontation, but by the quiet pressure of uncertainty. The silence he had once believed was his weapon had turned against him, and every moment he tried to fill it only widened the cracks. He didn't yet know that his undoing had already been set in motion, but his restlessness betrayed the truth. He could feel it, even if he couldn't see it. By the close of that day, I knew we were close. The cracks were spreading, the foundation weakening, and it was only a matter of time before the facade collapsed completely. Daniel and I had agreed to wait for the perfect moment, to ensure that when the final blow came, it would be undeniable, witnessed, and devastating. But even before that moment arrived, I could already see the victory forming. For the first time since his ultimatum, it was no longer I who carried the weight of his words. It was he who carried the weight of my silence, and that weight was crushing him piece by piece. The first crack in his confidence was not loud, not explosive, but quiet and irreversible. And I knew with certainty that once a crack appears, the collapse is only a matter of time. The 8th day arrived with the heaviness of inevitability, a day that carried the weight of everything Daniel and I had orchestrated in silence, every small move that had pushed them closer to the edge without their realizing it. For days, we had chipped away at their certainty, tightening the walls around them with evidence, whispers, and well-placed questions. Now it was time for the stage we had both agreed upon. The moment when the veil of secrecy would be torn, not in the privacy of whispered accusations, but in the bright, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. They had built their affair on stolen moments, on shadows, on the arrogant belief that no one would ever hold them accountable. What they never expected was that the reckoning would not come in a quiet confrontation at home, but in a room filled with eyes, ears, and the suffocating silence of judgment. Daniel was the one who proposed the setting, a business reception at one of the city's hotels, the kind of event my husband thrived on, where he could puff his chest, shake hands, and project the image of the respectable professional he pretended to be. Vanessa was expected to attend as well, dangling at the edge of Daniel's arm, smiling for photographs she didn't deserve to be in. It was perfect. There would be no escape, no denial possible when the truth was laid bare under chandeliers and the quiet hum of polite conversation. It wasn't rage that fueled us now, but precision, the determination to make them face their betrayal with no room left to spin, to force them to look in the mirror they had so long avoided. I arrived at the reception in a dress I hadn't worn in years, one I knew would draw eyes not because it screamed for attention, but because it carried a quiet dignity that could not be ignored. I walked into that room, not as the woman given 9 days to decide her fate, but as someone who had already written the ending. Across the room, I saw him, my husband, standing with a glass in his hand, laughing a little too loudly at some joke, his eyes scanning the crowd in that restless way of a man who always needed validation. Beside him stood Vanessa, her hand grazing his arm as though staking a claim, her smile wide but fragile, betraying the nerves that flickered behind it. They looked untouchable, so sure of their performance. And yet, I could see it already. The cracks, the unease, the faint shadow of doubt that clung to them after days of Daniel and me quietly haunting their steps. Daniel entered moments after me, his presence calm, controlled, his jaw set with the same resolve I felt in my own chest. We didn't need to exchange words. We had rehearsed this moment in silence, and the air between us was charged with understanding. We moved separately through the crowd, weaving between conversations, shaking hands, never revealing that our paths were converging on the same point. The anticipation built like the tightening of a bowstring, the knowledge that every step brought us closer to the moment when their carefully constructed reality would unravel. It happened with the simplicity of inevitability. At the height of the evening, when the speeches had ended and glasses clinked together in hollow toasts, Daniel approached Vanessa with the calmness of a man greeting his fiancée. "Vanessa," he said warmly, loud enough for those around to hear. She turned, her smile faltering when she saw him, her body stiffening, panic flashing briefly in her eyes. For a heartbeat, she tried to compose herself, to pretend that nothing was amiss, but the silence that fell around them was heavy, expectant. My husband, sensing something shift, turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he saw Daniel standing there, and that was when I stepped forward, my presence sudden and undeniable. "Oh, how lovely," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the murmurs of the crowd. All 4 of us in the same place. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward as heads turned, conversations halted, and every eye fixed on the tableau we had created. Vanessa's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. My husband froze, his glass trembling slightly in his hand, his carefully constructed smile collapsing under the weight of exposure. Daniel held up the folder we had built together, thin but heavy with the truth. Receipts, photographs, messages. He didn't need to wave it dramatically. The gesture itself was enough. "This," he said calmly, "is the story you both thought you could hide." His voice didn't rise, but it carried the authority of undeniable fact, the kind that silences excuses before they can even be formed. Around us, the crowd held its breath, the polite masks of society melting into open shock, whispers sparking like fire through dry grass. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I looked directly at my husband, my voice even, almost gentle. 9 days, I said. That's what you gave me. 9 days to decide if I wanted to stay. But it seems you'd already made your choice. My words were not for him alone, but for everyone listening, for every colleague and acquaintance who would carry this story with them long after the night ended. Vanessa stammered something, a denial perhaps, but her voice broke, and the silence that followed was louder than any protest. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not guilt, not regret, fear. Fear of what the truth meant, now that it was no longer hidden. Fear of the judgment radiating from the faces around him. Fear of the empire of lies crumbling beneath the weight of a few simple sentences. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came, only a tremor that betrayed his unraveling confidence. Daniel and I didn't linger. We didn't need to. We turned away together, leaving them to stand in the ruins of their own deceit, exposed not through rage, but through precision, through the undeniable clarity of evidence and presence. The room buzzed behind us as we walked away, the story already spinning into the whispers of the crowd, the judgment of society sealing their fate far more effectively than any private argument could have. That night, as I stepped into the quiet air outside, I felt the weight of 8 days lift from my shoulders. The ultimatum that once pressed against me like chains had become my liberation. The confrontation had not been loud, but it had been devastating. The kind of wound that could not be healed because it was inflicted not by hands but by truth itself. And as Daniel and I exchanged a glance of silent solidarity, I knew the game was no longer theirs. It had never been. It was ours. The 9th day did not arrive with thunder or fire, but with a quiet inevitability, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after the smoke clears, when both victor and defeated know the outcome has already been decided. My husband woke that morning, not with his usual restlessness, but with the heavy gait of a man walking toward an ending he could no longer deny. The confrontation of the night before had left its mark more deeply than either he or Vanessa had anticipated. Where once he had carried himself with arrogance, now there was a sag in his shoulders, a tightness around his mouth, a hollowness in his eyes. He still tried to pretend, of course, buttoning his shirt with deliberate care, tying his tie as if the ritual could stitch back together the reputation that had unraveled under the weight of Daniel's folder and my words. But there was no hiding the fracture. He looked like a man preparing for battle, but knowing the enemy had already claimed victory. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, every action precise, as if I were merely going about my day. He asked again, "Have you decided?" His voice stripped of confidence, almost desperate. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of cold finality that seemed to make him recoil. "Yes," I said simply, and let the word hang between us like the toll of a bell. I didn't elaborate, didn't offer explanation. He wanted clarity, a decision, but I had no intention of granting him the satisfaction of hearing my reasoning, because by now, it was not about whether I stayed or left. It was about ensuring that the collapse was total, that the final blow left nothing standing for him to rebuild. Throughout the day, the echoes of the previous night reached us. Messages trickled in from colleagues and acquaintances, their words sharp, veiled in polite phrases but soaked in judgment. I heard him on the phone, his tone defensive, insisting that misunderstandings had been blown out of proportion, that rumors were false. Yet the more he spoke, the more frantic he sounded, and the less anyone seemed to believe him. He hung up repeatedly, slamming his phone onto the counter, his face pale, his composure slipping with every unanswered call. Reputation, once cracked, spreads like shattered glass. Each shard cuts deeper, and he was bleeding from wounds he couldn't see but certainly felt. Daniel messaged me updates from his side. Vanessa was unraveling faster than my husband, cornered by whispers at her office, her fiancé's cold detachment, the knowledge that every smile she had performed now looked hollow to those who had once believed her. They had begun turning on each other, just as we knew they would, the strain of exposure pushing them from unity into accusation. He demanded explanations. She gave excuses. She accused him of betrayal even as she stood guilty herself. The implosion was inevitable, and all we had to do was watch as the edifice of their secret crumbled into dust. By the evening, the house itself felt different, no longer shared but divided into territories. He sat in the living room, slumped, staring at nothing as though waiting for me to deliver a verdict that no longer mattered. I took my time, arranging papers, sliding documents into a folder that held more weight than he realized. Financial transfers, joint assets redirected, legal contacts made in silence during the 9 days he thought I was paralyzed. I had built my fortress while he had been too busy chasing shadows. Now, when I closed the folder and placed it gently on the table between us, the sound was louder than any argument. He looked at it, then at me, confusion flickering into dread. "This," I said evenly, "is what 9 days has given me." His hand trembled as he reached for it, flipping through the papers, his face draining of color with every page. The accounts no longer under his control. The investments already shifted. The proof of his betrayal documented, archived, prepared not only for Daniel and me, but for lawyers, for anyone who needed to see. There was no way forward for him now, no clean exit, no reinvention. The life he thought he had been stepping into with Vanessa was gone before it began, dismantled not by rage, but by method. He tried to speak, but his voice broke, the words collapsing into silence. For the first time since the ultimatum, he was the one who could not finish a sentence. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence between us was victory enough. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the wife he had tried to discard, but as the strategist who had dismantled him in the span of 9 days. There was no scream, no explosion, only the realization sinking into him like lead that he had underestimated me, that the countdown he thought had cornered me had instead been the measure of his own destruction. By the time Daniel called later that evening, his voice steady, calm, telling me that Vanessa had moved out of his apartment and that their engagement was finished, I knew the parallel collapse was complete. 2 lives had imploded, not by chance, but by design. The final blow delivered not with noise but with precision. We had not needed to shout to the world. The evidence, the silence, the public confrontation, they had done all the work for us. As I lay in bed that night, the 9th night of his ultimatum, I thought back to the moment he had first uttered those words, his smug certainty, as he handed me a deadline. 9 days. He thought it would weaken me, paralyze me, reduce me to indecision. Instead, it had been the blueprint of his own undoing. He was asleep beside me, though sleep was too generous a word for the shallow, restless breaths of a man who no longer knew how to dream of control. I closed my eyes, not in despair, but in liberation, because tomorrow, when the 9 days had ended, it wouldn't be a question of whether I stayed or left. The decision had been made long ago, and by the time he realized it, he would already be standing in the ruins of everything he thought he could protect. The collapse was complete. The final blow had landed, and I, the woman he had tried to silence with a countdown, was the only one still standing. The 10th morning broke differently from all the others, not because the sun rose with any greater brilliance, but because I no longer felt the weight of a ticking clock pressing against my chest. The ultimatum was over. 9 days had passed, each one carrying me closer not to a decision about staying, as he had once framed it, but to a reckoning that had rewritten the script entirely. I woke with a strange stillness inside me, the kind that follows a storm when the air is clean again, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waking in someone else's shadow. The bed beside me was occupied by a man who had believed he held my fate in his hands, but now he looked smaller, diminished, a shell of the arrogance that had once strutted so loudly through our home. His breathing was shallow, restless even in sleep, as though he could feel the fragility of the world he had built crumbling beneath him. I slipped from the bed without a sound, and moved through the house, a space that had once felt like a cage, but now resembled a map of survival. Every corner held memories, but they no longer pierced me the way they once did. The photographs on the walls, the furniture chosen together, the echoes of laughter that had long since soured, all of it became part of a story that had ended. I no longer felt the urge to cling to what had been, nor the anger that once threatened to consume me. There was only clarity now, a steady acceptance that what was destroyed had needed to fall. Sometimes freedom doesn't arrive with open doors, but with the closing of the wrong ones, and as I stood in that silent house, I realized I wasn't grieving anymore. I was breathing. He woke later, stumbling into the kitchen with the tiredness of a man who had aged years in the span of days. He looked at me as though expecting a speech, an outburst, some final plea or declaration, but I offered none. My silence remained. not as a weapon this time, but as a shield of peace. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, stripped of all the confidence it once carried. I didn't answer him directly, because there was nothing left to say. The decision had been made long before, the steps already taken, the consequences already in motion. My lawyer had the documents, the accounts had been secured. The reputation he once valued above all else was already shredded beyond repair. He wanted to know what came next, but what he didn't understand was that what came next no longer included him. I walked past him, leaving his question suspended in the air, and stepped outside into the open day. The world seemed sharper somehow. The crispness of the wind, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the sound of people moving through their own lives without knowledge of the quiet war that had taken place in mine. I thought of Daniel, of the unexpected ally I had found in the ashes of betrayal, and felt a strange gratitude, not because we shared the same pain, but because we refused to let it consume us. Our alliance had never been born of love, but of something steadier, survival, clarity, justice, and perhaps that was stronger than any fleeting romance could have been. We had faced the storm together, and together we had ensured that those who betrayed us would carry their ruin alone. In the weeks that followed, life did not transform overnight into something dazzling or miraculous. Freedom is not fireworks. It is the quiet rebuilding of a self once muted by someone else's dominance. I moved forward slowly, deliberately, choosing each step with the awareness that I no longer needed to rush to prove myself to anyone. I began writing again, something I had abandoned years ago because it hadn't fit into his plans, his schedules, his need for the spotlight. I traveled to places I had always wanted to see. Not grand escapes, but small journeys that reminded me I was capable of moving on my own. Each choice was a thread, woven back into the fabric of my identity, a fabric he had tried to unravel, but that I was sewing back together with stronger stitches. I thought often of the irony. He had given me 9 days, a deadline meant to corner me, to force me into submission, to soften the blow of his betrayal by making me complicit in my own erasure. But those 9 days had been the greatest gift he could have given me, because they forced me to stop looking at myself through his eyes. They pushed me to step outside of the role I had been assigned, and realize that my silence could be power, my patience could be strategy, my composure could be liberation. The countdown had not been the end of me. It had been the beginning of someone I had forgotten I could be. Occasionally, I would hear fragments of his decline. A colleague who mentioned in passing that his business deals had faltered, that clients no longer trusted him. A friend who whispered about the whispers, how his name was always spoken with suspicion, with pity, with disdain. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. His downfall was not my triumph. My triumph was simply that I was no longer chained to him, no longer carrying his weight on my shoulders. The world had a way of balancing itself, and his collapse was only proof of that. One evening, months later, I found myself sitting on a balcony overlooking a quiet street, a glass of wine in hand, the air cool and steady. I thought back to that first night, to the moment he had looked at me and said, "You have 9 days to decide if you want to stay." I remembered how cold it had felt, how sharp the words had been, how small he had tried to make me, and I smiled, not with bitterness, but with the calm recognition that I had turned his countdown into my rebirth. He had thought he was the one granting permission, the one dictating terms, but in truth, all he had done was mark the time it would take for me to rise. The epilogue of that story was not about him, nor about the wreckage he left behind. It was about me, about freedom, about quiet strength, about the discovery that even in betrayal, even in endings, there can be beginnings that taste sweeter because of the struggle it took to reach them. The ultimatum was over. The 9 days were done. And beyond the countdown, I found not loss, but life, not despair, but freedom, not silence, but the steady voice of a woman who had learned that she was never truly powerless, only waiting to remember her own strength.